named Avery. You can follow Avery on Facebook. Avery goes into court with the kids up on the witness stand, and he'll sit there with them. It's the calmest lab I've ever seen in my life. I know they're lab Goldens make, but this dog is very calm. And so we'll sit up on the witness stand with the child who's facing his or her abuser right in front of them, and during trial, I mean, you all know how this goes. And the kids are like, no, I'll be okay because Avery will be there with me. So there's this dog that's specifically trained to help kids, and you can see how it would help adults as well, but they got specifically for the prosecutor's office for all of their child victims. And so they found one way to sort of begin to address this issue of the trauma in children. And a lot of times, families don't want their children, obviously, to go in court. But this is a way that the prosecutor has gotten this canine companion to help with that process. Yes, sir.
Yeah, two things that I found interesting about Officer Tooley was that the trauma, the incident had no expiration date. Her inability to keep track of the actual time, day, year. And then the other thing, the comparison between crisis and trauma. I've never heard it put across that way, and that's a really, I think, important piece.
Yeah, thank you for that. It is. And again, she's someone who has many resiliencies. And as you say, I think that's an excellent way of putting it. There was no expiration date on that. She is still a police officer. I mean, but she said she thinks about it every day, but in a different way. Yes.
There is a whole equation about trauma. There's a book that's called Too Scared to Cry, and it's a very, very great book that's from a famous San Francisco psychiatrist, and it tells the difference between a single episode of trauma and ongoing abusive trauma, and how it affects children specifically, and how it may play out and be treatable in adults. And so a more complex, it's a very complex equation about trauma that I don't want to trail off in different directions. The officer's situation was an episode of trauma that is beyond any comprehension of most people in life. The majority of people in life just don't experience that grave of trauma. That's quite, who could imagine?
Right.
So just to kind of touch, there's a whole equation about the long-term versus the individual trauma. Not saying that one is more traumatizing than the other. Certainly, hers is remarkable. PTSD is that is the how to describe it is that the experience of something beyond most humans' comprehension.
And most people who have experienced a traumatic event don't develop PTSD. And we do know that people who have other risk factors, well, I'll jump ahead here. I can't remember if I can go back or not. I don't think I can go back, so I'm not going to go back yet. But I mean, in your practice, in your courts, you see people who come in. I talked about social assets. Building on what those social assets are. Sometimes it's resources. I mean, literally resources to get treatment, or even in your community, you may not have the resources available for people for the kind of trauma-specific services that they need. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a little bit later. But some of these resiliencies are you can work on as a program. For example, people who can go to work. Work is important. And a couple of times I've talked before groups, and there have been people from NAMI there. And families are not always a good influence on people. But a lot of times people who come into treatment courts have really burned their bridges with their family in a lot of really profound ways. And same thing with friends. And oftentimes people who are in treatment programs such as drug courts and mental health courts, the only friends they have are people like them. And I think often, again, one of those programmatic issues, often we don't let people associate with people like them. And it's all they have. And we know that social supports are really important, so it's not just taking away those supports as much as we don't like them, but it has to be replaced with something. Because the ones that we traditionally think of, and reuniting families I know is often a goal, and reuniting parents with their children and rebuilding those relationships. But for people who've been around a few, two tours of duty through the court, they don't have a lot of social support left. And so it's interesting, the NAMI families often will say, well, that's the only friend my son has. So now you're telling him he can't have his one friend. And so I think it's something to keep in mind. And I also think this is why it's really important to involve peers in programs. Because these are people who in many cases have graduated from the very same programs that you're working with or a similar program. They've been through it. They can talk about the challenges. They can become not just, it might even be a certified peer mentor or a peer specialist, and that's great, or a recovery coach is another phrase that's used. But that is really important for long-term success for people in treatment programs like this. When there's a lot of conditions and a lot of restrictions, someone other than us has to tell them why they should be doing this. Okay, and peers are a very good way of bringing the real life experience of success back to the people who are struggling with early phases of the program. And we have a lot of information about that too if you want to, we can talk about that later. Certain people have certain risk factors that are innate. We know, for example, people who have lower intelligence, no matter how you measure it, are at greater risk for traumatic experiences. And we know that people who experience injury or maybe it's because of their drug use, but injury and have traumatic brain injury are at greater risk of suffering subsequent traumas as well. And the lives that many people who come into drug courts and mental health courts and co-occurring courts and veterans courts, the life they lead often puts them in a less safe environment that again increases the risk. We know that people who have experienced one trauma, and it speaks a little bit to what the woman in the front here had said, one trauma, they're more likely to experience subsequent traumas. People who go into the military, women in particular, have very high rates of pre-combat trauma, much higher than their civilian peers. Many women say they go into the military to get away from a really bad situation. So if a woman has experienced combat trauma, chances are she experienced pretty significant trauma before she even went into the military. And then there are subsequent things that happen. Women veterans, for example, are 5 times more likely to be homeless than male veterans are. And as of a couple of years ago, and I mean like 2, there were only 2 homeless shelters for women veterans in the United States that accepted children. 2. So, losing children, I mentioned, is having your children taken away from you. So these are, if a woman has experienced combat trauma, assume she had a lot of other stuff going on both before and after. And we know military sexual trauma is extremely pervasive as well. When people are exposed to high levels of stress on a regular basis, they create way too much cortisol in their brain. And it keeps them, she talked about that hypervigilance and that being on edge all the time. Your body loses the capacity of responding normally to situations. You're on high alert all the time. We've all had that feeling. When you get scared, you got that adrenaline feeling. People who experience multiple traumas have that all the time. They're on that level of high alert. Your body just gets worn out. You can't function at that level. You can't. But that fight or flight response, you're constantly in the fight response. Think about how this plays out then in behavior. Okay? Someone touches you in a non-aggressive way. Okay? It may be an appropriate touch. It may be not an appropriate touch. But just the responses, and we can imagine how that escalates from there. And numerous traumas certainly have that kind of impact on people over and over again. And we're just learning more about this. I think it's really fascinating. It erodes the brain, it erodes the normal neurons and pathways in your brain. Drug abuse does too, by the way. And it almost rewires your brain.
Just a very interesting article about cortisol levels, and we have a program here in San Francisco, that a companion dog, depending on the situation, but a companion dog really does lower the cortisol levels. And so we have a program here where homeless people on the streets, veterans or whatnot, can also get a dog from the shelter, and they're responsible for that dog, and they go to a station and get free food. But it's just to mention, because that is a new thing that we're studying, the cortisol levels in the brain.
And it increases even just for people who have dogs, at home, and you wouldn't be considered a trauma survivor. Petting your dog actually raises your oxytocin levels in your brain, which is a calming hormone, and it also increases it in the dog, which is pretty cool. So it does you both good. And we know pet therapy programs in prisons and others have been generally successful in terms, and teaches responsibility and caring for another living thing. So one of the things that's really important to avoid and is blaming someone for their inability to really cope with the trauma. Just because their brother seems to do just fine, it's not their fault that they're not doing fine. People are very different. I mean, if you have any siblings, you know. If you have children, you know. It's just people are different. People come in with different experiences. Their interpretation is different. How they experience, say, failing a grade or being held back is different. So it's really, although we talk about individualized experiences, it is very personal, but it's also not an avenue to blame or to sort of hang responsibility on. It's a way of addressing, especially when you know there are certain things you can't change, like who your parents are, but you can change employment opportunities, you can change connections to the community, you can bring peer groups into the court to provide peer mentors and friendships with people who are healthy friendships, etc. So it's a way of thinking about what someone's risks and resiliences are and really build on their assets. So just to bring it full circle is that it is those 3 E's, just keeping that in mind, not cutting it off at the event, but it's all 3. It's the event, it's the experience, and it's the effect that it has. Like Officer Tully said, it was pervasive. She couldn't run. Okay, everybody seemed like they were out to get her. And thinking about how your programs and your own behaviors might be exacerbating the effect well beyond the timing or the expiration date, if you will, of the traumatic event. I think. Or where's the timekeeper? Is it break time? Okay. So we'll take a break.
So thank you. We're going to have a 15-minute break. And so please, there are refreshments and an opportunity for everyone to talk out in the front part of the building. One thing we do ask, please be in respecting the rules of the ASC, please don't bring food into here or drugs.
Water in.
It's very important because that is an ironclad rule they have here. It's the only way we're allowed to use it. Oh, I'm sorry. All right. We will have a 15-minute break, and please don't bring food or drinks into the auditorium. This is not owned by the AOC, and therefore we have to keep it in pristine condition. Thank you. Wonderful, Jeff.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Are we on time?
Hope you didn't